Well, here we are at the NRA annual meeting, and my goodness, what a privilege to meet you in person, Dr. David Yamane, the author of first Concealed Carry Revolution, and now Gun Curious. And when is Gun Curious being published, just so that we know when we should go shopping?
Yeah, well, Gun Curious will come out officially on June 1st, but fortunately the publisher was nice enough, knowing I was coming to the NRA meeting this year, to send me with some advanced copies. So I do have some copies with me, but if you pre-order the book on Amazon or any place, or if you want to buy the book and get it right away, it'll be available June 1st.
Perfect. That coincides very nicely because our journal comes out on June 1st, and so we aren't getting people excited about something that they can't get.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that.
But to the topic today, as I was reading your book, I couldn't help but think of that Robert Burns, I don't know whether you could even say it was a poem, and I'm not going to try to do the language, would some power the gift give us to see others as others see us. And it was funny because it was to a louse on seeing it on the lady's hat in church. I don't know if you follow literature. It's one of my favorites because he had he had such an ironic sense of the world. But I think that as I was reading Gun Curious, and I think it's going to be reflected in some of the things I'd like to explore with you, is I like to think of myself as fairly open-minded and as wanting to know how other people think and live and go through their lives. But it really made me aware that we do have some really big divides, and that I've got big blind spots also. And so some of my takeaway from today is going to be, well, I know what makes me uncomfortable, but what am I doing that does that to people, even to yourself, because your background's a lot different than mine, and we'll get into that because it's fascinating. But kind of coming across that divide is, interestingly enough, as I was reading the Gun Curious Advance, I also ran across a pretty long feature piece in the LA Times from an instructor who said that he had built his instructional business, his firearms instruction, and I think it was NRA basic safety and those types of things, for progressives. And he stressed literally how he didn't want the stereotypical gun owner that can, his words, I'm going to read this because it hit me so hard: conservative, nationalistic, right-wing, homophobic, transphobic, misogynistic, and calling out the male-dominated gun world. And I said, oh my, I don't think that's the world I live in. Right. But it was interesting to me that gentleman and apparently his clientele were so put off by really the milieu that I've moved in my whole life, and then it coincided with your book, and what a divide, and maybe that I didn't even realize. Maybe I didn't even realize how deep it was. Does that mirror your experience?
Yeah, so I mean, I know who you're talking about, LA progressive shooters, and I think that I see that element sort of within the gun culture. I don't think it's the main element of the gun culture. And one of the chapter 1 of the book is called Guns Are Normal and Normal People Use Guns. And this came about because I was doing a podcast several years before the book came out, and the interviewer said, what's one of the surprising things you've learned about guns and gun owners in your time in your studies? And I said, well, probably the biggest thing I learned as someone who came from outside of gun culture is that gun owners are people too. Gun owners have families, and they care about the country, and they care about safety, and they want to have a strong society, and they want to protect children, and they want safety, and all of the things that everybody wants for their families and their communities, gun owners also want. But if you come to it from the outside, as I did, and as I think as Tom Wynn from LA Progressive Shooters.
Is that the name?
It's oftentimes you tend to see the worst in other people, right? And I feel much more comfortable in gun culture today than I did 12 years ago, but there's still parts of gun culture that I just am not going to fit into. And that's okay. I think
that hurts my heart.
Well, no, but there's probably parts of gun culture that make you go like, ooh, you're not totally comfortable with that, right?
Good point.
So, and I'm drawn to people and organizations like Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network, who I think represent the best of gun owners, the best of gun culture, the best, and I focus a lot on defensive gun culture, and I think the best of what it means to be a defensive gun owner in a morally and ethically and legally responsible way. So I see some of the downsides. I just feel like there's a lot of misrepresentation, and again, coming from outside of gun culture is useful because I kind of have one foot in my everyday life, sitting in my university office, teaching in my classroom at an elite private university, which is basically synonymous with liberal.
Well, tell us a little bit about that, because I'm not sure that our viewers know what profession and what I would say science really you are deeply, deeply embedded in, and have published other works on topics that have nothing to do with ours. So tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah.
You're a professor.
Yeah, so I'm a professor of sociology. I've been doing sociology since 1988 when I was an undergraduate, and I just went straight to graduate school and got a job as a professor. Sociology is the systematic study of society, and so we look at all sorts of different things. I used to study religion, kind of got tired of studying religion, and I was looking for a new project. Wow. And around the same time I was looking for a new project, I met my wife, Sandy, who appears a lot, maybe not enough for some people's taste.
That's right.
In the book, and many other people in North Carolina who were gun owners. People I played tennis with, IT professionals, my real estate agent, Sandy, carried a gun as a member of the Coast Guard. And so, I was like, wow, I must be the only person in North Carolina that doesn't own or doesn't know anything about
you
guns.
Probably were.
Yeah. And so that was sort of, my entry into the field, both personally and professionally. So and I think the Gun Curious in the title really is speaking to that personal curiosity I had about guns, and also my professional curiosity to know more about guns. And but it really is sociology. I saw some recent data. They said I think 99% of all sociologists identify as Democrats if you ask them, what's your political party affiliation. So my everyday life, the people I tend to know, the people I work with, they're pretty. If you're liberal, like I consider myself liberal, that means you're kind of, center left. The weight of the field is actually, more probably consider themselves progressive.
I see.
So to the left of
Get
where
the
I'm
terminology correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, but coming to the issue of guns from that perspective, I did share a lot of the misunderstandings of, who gun owners were, what gun ownership was about, and I think the story I tell in the book is really about how I became and matured and continue to mature as a gun owner.
Yes, and it's part of personal growth. But back to Wake Forest University then, does the political attitude there mirror the sociology field in general, or are they more like your real estate agent? Are there fellow professors who share your enjoyment of shooting?
Yeah. So, I think the social sciences are more liberal than some of the other disciplines. The humanities maybe tend to be a little more, you don't want to say conservative, because I think everybody's pretty much left of center, but they tend to be more conservative. People in the sciences actually may edge over into actually being right of center, and people in the business school I think are more conservative. So
I'm sure.
So there is a range of views. I think in a lot of cases the loudest voices get the most attention. So at the university, the loudest voices tend to be kind of the most progressive voices. So there's a diversity. Our student body has it's not just Southern, but there are more Southerners in our student body, so they tend to be a little bit more conservative. And but still, when I teach my sociology of guns class, or when I'm just kind of in the faculty in general, most people don't have a background in firearms, or I think significantly the ones who do oftentimes are not open about it. So
well, yes, and for reason.
Yeah, for good reasons.
Yes.
When I came out as a gun owner, really at the 2019 National Firearms Law Seminar,
Yes.
There were people who contacted me from the university who were kind of like, "Oh, by the way, I'm a gun owner too."
Yes.
Very quietly,
Yes.
off the record, or who said, I'm really interested. I've been thinking about getting a gun. Can you advise me, or could you take me to the range? But very much on the down low. And again, there's good reasons for people in the university setting not to too openly identify as gun owners. Now, when I started my project, I had tenure. I was almost fully promoted, so there's really not, I was in a very safe position. But when I advise graduate students who are thinking like, they reach out to me and say, hey, I really like your work. I'm thinking about studying guns. And I said, I don't think that's a good idea. I honestly don't think it's a good idea if you're a graduate student or an untenured faculty member to write anything that's basically not critical of guns. That you really need to be where the discipline is, which is extremely critical of guns, gun ownership, and gun culture.
Or at least be closeted.
Yeah. But you can't be closeted in your work, right? You can have those personal views.
Good point.
But if you're going to actually be doing research, and I have a student who took my sociology of guns class as an undergraduate, and she's studying as a graduate student now, and she's doing a project on gun shows, and she's submitted an application for research funding, and one of the responses to her proposal was, this isn't critical enough. And so I said, well, I can't tell you I'm surprised that you heard that. I'm sorry, but that's the reality of it. So it's very unfortunate, because we need more scholarship that looks at the full spectrum. People should study violence and negative outcomes that involve firearms. That's important, but that's a very small part of the whole overall reality of guns in America.
Well, and I find it interesting that to your new area of exploration, when you were beginning to dip your toe in the river, that you were already a published author, right? And generally on topics of like how many books, and what was your focus on your previous publications?
Yeah, well, I studied American religion basically. My first job was at the University of Notre Dame, so I have some work on American Catholicism. But I had published or edited or co-authored 6 or 7 books. I was the editor of a couple of major journals in the field of the sociology of religion. So, people I was known and respected. And so, that helped when I transitioned over to studying guns. I had no reputation or knowledge in that area, no standing in that area. But if anybody wanted to know who I was, they could look and say, oh, this guy has been, working as a sociologist for 20 years now. And, my first publication was in 1994. So.
Well, and as we start in the gun community, as we start to become aware of you, we Google your name. And we say, look at all this, look at all this sociology of religion and faith issues. How interesting, and we almost wonder, is this the same person? And it is.
Yeah, I can tell you a funny story, and maybe it's not funny. So, when I started entering the field, I had no standing as a sociologist among other scholars of guns, but also when I was trying to get into the field to study gun culture, I had no standing as a member of the gun community.
Oh, you're a noob.
And I was new, and I think that people within the gun community rightly have concern if a sociologist writes to them and says, hey, I'd like to observe your course, or can I come hang out on the range with you?
Yes.
And I totally understood that. So I was fortunate that the first gun training course I took was MAG 40. And after I took the course, I asked Moss, would you write a letter of introduction for me that I could use when I'm contacting other trainers? You don't have to say you agree with what I'm saying, but just say, I know this person, he's been in my class. And Moss was good enough to do that. And for the first probably year, I would, if I contacted Tom Givens or Ken Campbell at Gunsight, I sent the letter, and it totally, they did their own due diligence. I know that Ken Campbell probably ran a background check on me.
He at least Googled your name.
Yeah, but that opened a lot of doors for me. And at some point, I didn't have to continue sending the letter, because I did then have a reputation as someone who was going to treat people fairly.
We knew it wasn't going to be a sting.
Yeah.
And everybody has been stung at some time or another where the things we say are misinterpreted, and words are so fungible anyway that it's kind of a risk, and we don't always take the risk. One of the things you wrote about, and again, that's why I referenced your previously heavily published, respected sociologist, that you wrote in your book that you began to shop Gun Curious out, and one of the rejection letters called it, am I correct, reprehensible?
Irresponsible, and the word that they actually used was repressible.
Oh.
And I actually thought it was a typo. And I was like,
okay.
and so I Googled it, and repressible is basically the opposite of irrepressible. Right, so if something is irrepressible, you can't put it down.
Yeah.
But if something is repressible, it means you can and should put it down. So the word was very carefully chosen to say. And what followed that was, basically built on the backs of the lives of children who've been sacrificed. And I think not everybody thought that, but I think that captured a part of the sentiment among the New York publishing industry. That
it had to be hard to keep putting it out there when you were getting poked so hard by that.
Yeah.
How did you set the hook with Exposit Books? Is that who?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
So I had 30. That reviewer was the 33rd rejection, and I had one of the best nonfiction agents in New York at one of the biggest literary agencies. So this guy is not used to rejection at all. He's like, he sells a lot of books every year. And he said after 33 rejections, he said, I'm really sorry, there's nothing more I can do.
Oh my.
So I said, okay, well, I either have to redo the whole project along the lines of what these editors are looking for, or I have to self-publish it. And I thought, well, self-publishing is, there's a lot of positives, but there's a lot of negatives to that also. And so as I'm reviewing my options, I get a LinkedIn message from this woman who says, I'm a Wake Forest graduate in sociology. My kids went to Wake Forest, and I'm an editor at McFarland, which is a North Carolina family-owned independent academic publisher. And she said, are you writing a book? And I was like, well, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
But I said, hey, before I even bother sending a proposal, I want to meet with you and tell you what the book is about and what reception I've received. And so I sat down for lunch with her up in Jefferson, North Carolina. And, I said, there's basically been a lot of bias against the book. And I just don't want to waste anybody's time. And she said, well, look, I'm from North Carolina. My grandparents are gun owners. My parents are gun owners. I'm a gun owner. Everybody around here is a gun owner. And we don't have any problem with a book that isn't fundamentally critical about guns. We just want a book that is interesting, that tells the truth, and that we can sell. And I said, oh, I think you can sell the book.
Nice.
And so, sent her the proposal. They accepted it, and I finished the book up. And so Exposit is an imprint of McFarland and Company. I'm grateful to them, and like I said before, they sent me here with some copies of the book to sell in advance. And so it's been a great relationship, and I like to say it's kind of forest to bookstore, whatever the book equivalent of farm to table is. I learned to shoot in North Carolina. I wrote the book in North Carolina. They're North Carolina publishers. So
but you also did something that we might not have thought about, because we're so used to sending emails and texts and that type of thing. You did a face-to-face. You helped her see you as a human being, and look what it did. Look what it did for bringing out some material that I think is going to be so useful to all of us. Now, one of the things that I found interesting about Gun Curious, and again, because of knowing that you had been a heavily published professional author before, is it's got to be really different. You bare your soul in this book. You tell us some things about your boyhood in Southern California, am I
Northern
right?
California,
the Bay Area. That's right. Yeah, I got California mapped out wrong in my mind. About your boyhood and as you grew up, and then as you become this liberal university professor, as you said a few minutes ago, in an elite university, you tell us a lot of things about David, and that's got to be real different from writing a professional journal. How did that feel to you, putting these things down on paper for all of us to see?
Yeah, very different, as you said. When I first tried to publish this book, this was a long time ago, before this last series of rejections, but I thought I was just going to write another academic book. That was something I was comfortable doing, and 400 people buy it, and it goes into some libraries. But you're contributing to your field, and I had some mixed reviews of what the proposal I had written. But shortly after that, I was invited to present at the National Firearms Law Seminar in 2019, and that's the time where I thought, well, I'm talking to a bunch of gun lawyers on their lunch break.
Yes, you are.
What am I going to say that's going to be, keep their attention? And I thought, well, I should just tell my story. Tell the story of how I became a gun owner and what I learned in the process. And the reception to that was so positive that at that moment I thought, that's what the book has to be. Like to write another academic book. I've written all the academic books. I'm not going to get more promotions. I'm basically where I'm at. And so I thought I'm going to try to write a book that I think that people in general will read, like anybody who's interested in the topic. And so, it was not comfortable. I had to learn how to write in a different way. I mean, I don't think it's there's certain things that I just can't do as a writer that some people who are professional writers can do, but I do think that hopefully people feel the authenticity.
I certainly did. I will say for myself that's something that'll stick with me going forward, is that you've got the ability to connect with people through words, and I know that professional writing is so different than. I mean, it's not there are autobiographical elements in it, but then the sociologist weighs in and gives us a little lecture, gives us a little lesson, and there's some interesting lessons in there. I don't know if I had time to ask some questions about some of those, but it just made me nervous for you, because it seemed to me that it raised the potential for so many personal criticisms of someone that I know to be a good man. Yeah. Has there been personal attacks against you?
I think this guy sort of goes back to something we're edging into a little bit, is the thing that is most disappointing to me is from the gun side, that there are some people who see liberal in the title and they just don't want to. That's it for them.
I've got some questions for you about that myself. Yeah.
And it was we went back and forth as to whether we should put either liberal or professor, and there might be a redundancy there also in the subtitle. But I thought I wanted, and again, in this transparency, I didn't want someone to pick up the book and just go, wait a second, that's not what I thought this book was going to be about. So, it really is telling the story of how a liberal professor became a gun owner, and I wanted to make that sort of truth in advertising on the cover. So I think people who from the gun side who just don't want to hear anything about it, that's a little frustrating. And then on the same time, for people outside, because part of the curiosity is my own curiosity, but part of it is, like, if you're curious about guns, maybe look at this book. And so I'm trying to appeal in part to my gun skeptical friends and colleagues, and invite them to be curious, to learn something that they don't know about guns. And I think a lot of them have the same reaction. They're fine with the liberal professor part, they're just not happy about the gun part. So it's frustrating when you're trying to have a moderate voice, to speak the truth, to invite people into a conversation, and people don't want to engage. So that's probably the biggest frustration. I haven't had, I don't read the comments in a lot of places where you get the personal attacks.
Me neither. I absolutely won't read comments on YouTube.
So,
and you shouldn't.
So I feel pretty good about it. But then again, the book hasn't been out, so I'll be interested to see once it gets out there.
And yet I see the book as such an extension of your video and your blogging that I think you've already given us entry into a lot of that as to who you are. Now it's just in a permanent, tangible form. But one of the things that you wrote in there, you said you're not necessarily pro-gun, but you're pro-understanding in it. And of course, confession, I thought, man, I can think of so many ways that I wish that the people who want to take away my self-defense rights would understand me, right? And I caught myself in an awful lot of kind of knee-jerk type reactions, and so it was a good growth experience for me to have to stand back and look at myself a little bit. But I'm wondering, maybe even just the top three or the top leading mischaracterizations that armed citizens make when we're trying to understand those who, I mean, to my mind, I still see it as trying to take away my self-defense options.
Yeah.
Where am I going wrong here?
Yeah. Well, I think that the thing that I know from having come outside of
Yes.
gun culture is that we just don't know anything about guns or about self-defense, really. We outsource our violence to law enforcement, right? If we have a problem, we pick up the phone and then we hope someone comes to help us. So, I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding just about what it means to be a defensive gun owner. And this, when we see, terrible instances of criminal violence that's cast as self-defense, that just becomes the standard model of self-defense when they're really exceptional cases.
Yes.
And so, to understand, most defensive gun owners don't want to use their firearms to defend themselves,
Yes.
and that they are judicious about the use of lethal force, and they do have ethical concerns about taking human life. And, so I think that trying to convey all of those things to people who really have no idea, they don't even have a visceral or sense of, I might have to harm another person to help myself or to help one of my loved ones. And that was really one of the pivotal changes for me was when I was in this parking lot confrontation, trying to be a good Samaritan and trying to step in and help my neighbor who was being accosted, and kind of fortunately getting out of the situation unharmed, but really realizing that I had put myself in the middle of something that could have gone horribly wrong, and I had my 2 little kids with me.
And that's always that's what brings people around sometimes. You'll sacrifice yourself sometimes, but not your offspring.
But I had that visceral feeling inside of me that basically said, in this moment, I would do anything to protect my kids.
Exactly.
And that, to include using violence, which I never thought that I would ever use violence, in my life.
But you were self-aware enough to actually recognize, not that I'm just uncomfortable, but wow, I've got this potential inside of me.
Yeah.
And I gather you really hadn't come to terms with that before.
Yeah. And because of my whole life, I was in my 30s by then, and I really never had any experience of violence in my life. I lived like most Americans do. We live peaceful lives. We don't look for trouble. We don't get in trouble. Trouble, fortunately, doesn't come to us. And so you can live, a lot of your life in the United States without ever having to confront the real need for potential for violence. And so, that's one of the things I appreciate or try to appreciate about people who don't understand defensive gun culture is that they don't, fortunately, have any need to really until they really do. And then, oftentimes it may be too late. So.
Badly unprepared. Yeah. And thank the Lord for that level of safety that we've had. I used to, when I still taught, I would quip because people would want to know, have you ever, right? And people always ask you that. And I would quip, no, I would love to be checking into the old ladies' home at 98 years of age and never had to have employed this. But you're absolutely right. That's a big part of our mindset. But it's just so alarming to think about those who we don't want them to have a violent experience, and yet how do we help open the doors as you have, and wonder what that even means, because when I start thinking liberal, I'll go to the mirror, and for me conservative is fiscal conservative, not wanting the heavy hand of government conservative, all of those things that have kind of driven me, all the years to accomplish the things I've accomplished, such as those are, and then I see this opposite, and I have to ask myself, do I even know what it means to be a liberal professor?
Yeah.
How do you contrast the man you are to some of the people that we see at these shows?
Yeah. And I think there are many definitions of liberals. Some that even people who we think of as conservative would be more comfortable with. More kind of libertarian forms of liberal. But for me, I think part of liberalism is that impulse, to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and welcome the refugee. And that I do see a role for the government in helping to do some of those things, but also, being a very big proponent of defending our civil rights, and so we have the court system to defend our civil rights when the government overreaches. And so those are, I think, some of the keys for me to being a liberal, and probably, the role of the government would be the biggest difference between me as a liberal and you as a conservative. What's the where do we draw the line for government involvement in things? But I think we also would agree on a lot of things, especially on the civil rights side, and about as we said in our sort of pre-conversation about wanting to have a better society. Right? We all want to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and be welcoming to the stranger. But we have different ways of realizing
Bingo.
that.
Exactly. I think our paths to maybe accomplishing the same good might be wildly different.
Which is okay. That's one of the things that I really kind of like to talk about is having come so far in my own life with respect to guns, is realizing like we don't all have to agree on everything, right? That part of being an American, 340 million people in a pluralistic democracy with people from all sorts of different backgrounds, is that we're never all going to agree on everything, right? But we have to agree on certain fundamental rules of the game. But at the end of the day, we might sometimes have to say, hey, it was great talking to you. We don't agree on this, but I respect the fact that you're a fellow citizen, and if you respect the fact that I'm a fellow citizen, then that's okay.
You may have just given me the key I was looking for, the word respect. Can we feel that for one another? Well, obviously I can very much feel that for you in spades, but that would be something that maybe, again, we go back to that, well, I feel misunderstood, they feel misunderstood. Where do we find that common ground that starts to maybe be that bridge across the chasm? And maybe it's something as simple as what you just said.
Well, I think, we say if we start our conversations with what we have in common rather than where we differ, it just kind of sets a different tone. So I'll be speaking to diverse groups of people sometimes, and I'll just start by saying, everybody who's in favor of violence, gun violence, raise your hand. Like, who's opposed to gun safety, raise your hand. Like, we all, are for gun safety. We're all against gun violence. And, how we may get there differs, but we may also find points of agreement on how we get there. But if we really start with this recognition, we all have the same desires, not all, but we have many of the same desires, many of the same goals. And I think from the gun owner side, Tony Simon said it first, as basically taking it from him, but he said, maybe instead of trying to meet people halfway, go 60%, right? Really say like, hey, I want you to try and understand why gun ownership makes sense to me. I want to understand why guns don't make sense to you. And I think that empathy, it can be a real, healing balm in the sense that there are many people who are opposed to guns because all they know about guns are negative things. They're tearing apart their communities. They, harm their children. And so if that's your entire experience of guns, why would you have positive feelings about guns?
Indeed.
And for us to understand that, like, I say, like, I understand that you don't like guns, but please understand why guns make sense to literally tens of millions of people who are gun owners and whose guns will never hurt anybody.
Indeed. And it even, I think, you talked about our shared goals and our shared, the things that we can agree on. I think then we have to address what our fears are, because our fears are many times what separate us. And even one of the language uses that's a hot button point for me, and so I'm just going to own this, is I really have trouble with the term gun violence. I firmly believe that there's an awful lot of human violence and has been for millennia and will be long after I am no longer walk this earth. But I wonder how that is not an inflammatory phrase that kind of colors colors the conversation. I have huge issues. Help me understand. Help me get past that knee-jerk reaction. Because I've got huge issues with the term gun violence.
And I use it as a sort of shorthand and an easy way to refer to sort of negative outcomes that are committed with firearms. And I totally understand why people who are in the gun community are like, there's many ways that you can commit violence. The instrument is just a tool. But the other side of me recognizes that guns are particularly good at doing these kinds of things. And as Tom Gibbons said, if they weren't, they wouldn't be of any use to us.
Yes.
And so, guns are particularly lethal for good and for bad. So, it is not accidental that most people who are murdered with guns. A lot of people who commit suicide with guns. Guns are one of the most lethal means of committing suicide. So, I would never tell someone that they were wrong for objecting to the term gun violence, but those are some of the reasons why I haven't stopped using the term. And it is a sort of common ground for me to engage people who are outside of the gun culture, because that is a term they use. And if I started every conversation with those people by saying gun violence isn't a thing, then we're not going to get anywhere.
Okay.
Right? So I'm happy to say, yes, gun violence is terrible. The homicide is terrible by any means, and guns are a lot of that. Suicide with firearms is terrible. It's a very effective means. Children accidentally shooting themselves or someone else, that's terrible. And you don't often see, children knifing each other to death or accidentally bludgeoning each other to death. So, and if I accept those terms of the debate with them, then they can continue at least some of the way, and maybe they'll go 60% toward me and hear me more. So
I really needed to hear your thinking on that.
And it's okay if we don't fully agree on that, right?
I had a hard time getting past that. I had to go back and look at my book notes after I'd read yours, and it's like, okay, I've just got to ask him about this because I know your scholastic background, and I know what a good thinker, deep digging into things. I knew there had to be a reason, and I needed to hear it.
Yeah, but I think it's a totally fair question. I feel like this is one of the things. I have a chapter on the AR-15. Was really wrenching for me to write because it's such a fraught issue in our society. And one of the things that I end up saying in it is, basically, I just don't believe that if we banned and eliminated all AR-15s from our society, that we would not have mass shootings. Mass shootings would continue. If we took away all the guns, then we'd go back to mass bombings or people driving trucks into crowds. So that element of saying, like, hey, if you think that just controlling guns is going to reduce all these or eliminate all these problems, you're just wrong.
Yeah, we're not going to get across the divide on that one, simply because it flies in the face of reason. And I think that's the hard thing about compromise is there's a few things I'm really sure of. And one of them being that violence would continue, even if, and I remember there was, I think it was a lawyer that a staff member of mine was trying to recruit as an affiliated attorney, and he turned out not to be favorable towards guns. We didn't know that based on the recommendation. And he writes back, I wish all the guns could be thrown in the ocean. And of course, at that point, we knew we had no common ground. But it goes to that point. Then we're just going to start running over each other, or doing other things, because there's so many ways to do violence. Well, I appreciate your kindness towards me on that one, because I'm not a debater and I'm not an academic, and I stumble and bumble over words. But
hold on. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think that when we think of ourselves as being in a debate with other people, that's actually can be part of that dead end, because in a debate, someone wins and someone loses. So I think we should always enter these things as thinking we're in conversation with someone, right? Because you can't win a conversation, right? You can only try to gain understanding in a conversation.
I was scared to even ask you for that, because I didn't want to get in over my head in a verbal battle. And you say we don't do those. that would be something for us to take forward with the coworker, with the person at the art studio, wherever we go do our lives that we are exposed to people who don't think as we think.
Right. And we, with the political polarization we have, and social media makes it worse, that we oftentimes enter into these things as saying like, oh, I hate that, with anger or frustration, or wanting to win. And I think that we get much further if we try to understand rather than try to win.
Thank you for that.
You also sell yourself short, because I have a certain level of understanding based on the work I do, but your involvement in what you do for years and years and years, there are many things that you know much better than I know, right? And so, I think that's one of the things we come to appreciate, is our what we know and what we don't know.
And more the privilege to share with each other.
Yeah.
Because your book shared a lot of very cool things with me, things from the social sciences that I would have never been exposed to, and now I have curiosity. For me, no, it's not going to be about the gun, because that's been my life for 40 years, but for me, there's going to be curiosity. There was that nifty thing, and I'm going to go off topic here because I missed it, about the role of projectile weaponry in dominant societies. That got my interest. Now I've got to find some more reading on that, because that was fascinating. I was glad you put that in there. Yeah,
that was something that I thought, man, people may just. I hope they don't tune out because it comes in early in the book, and I thought, well, if it doesn't sort of resonate with people, hopefully they'll just skip that and move on. But I think I talk about contemporary society and the normality of guns in contemporary society, but it really is deeply rooted in human history. It's like rooted in Homo sapien history, right? That if we didn't have a proficiency with making tools and making weapons and using weapons, then we would not be the dominant species on the planet. And so when people think, oh, well, we can just get rid of guns, they almost never mean we'll get rid of guns entirely. What they really mean is we'll get rid of civilian ownership of guns, and then there'll just be a monopoly on that in the hands of the government, right? Which is what many, voluntarily or not, most countries in the world, that's the option they've taken. The uniqueness about the United States is that we've never had that, monopoly.
Right. Yes.
But there always has to be that use of projectile weaponry to basically maintain society as a sort of coherent entity. If there wasn't that, that, again, to our previous conversation, if you take away the projectile weapons, then the strongest people who have the impact weapons are going to take over society. And so the reality of that is, I think, pretty significant.
Yeah. Well, it is a fascinating book. People get it. It's out today, June 1st, because we're doing a little advanced work here, thank goodness. What would you like us to take away from the time you've so generously given us today?
Yeah, well, for me, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and I did bring with me my Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network card. They didn't ask me to do this, but I've been a member since June of 2012. I've really been a gun owner since 2011, and so I was fortunate to take Mag 40 with Massad Ayub, and he emphasized the importance of having some sort of legal protection or legal defense, in the terrible and unlikely event that you have to use lethal force to defend yourself. And so, I appreciate the work you do, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and your open-mindedness, and I think that again, the curiosity, whether you're a gun owner and you've always been a gun owner and you want to understand what it's like not to be there, or if you're a gun skeptic and you don't understand why do people own guns, or there's a lot of gun curious people out there, right? There are people who they don't currently own guns, but they're interested in guns, and we saw a lot of those people go from being gun curious to being gun owners, since 2020.
Yes.
And, so hopefully if there's some people out there that are like that, who are thinking about it, or new gun owners, they can see what it takes to go from being a new gun owner to being, I think, I like to think of myself as a more mature gun owner today, but
Yes,
still
you
growing.
are. Oh, we all are. We are all. When we stop growing, then we stop asking these questions. Then we stop bridging that divide, and it just gets worse. Well, I just have an idea listening to you, and that is if our listeners have family members that are skeptical. That was a great word you used, by the way. Share the video.
Yeah.
He's not wearing a red flannel shirt, and he has all his teeth. Right.
So far.
Well, we are getting older,
Yeah.
but at any rate, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for
This has
having
been
me.
a privilege.
Yeah, for me as well.